Welcome to the Top of the Class podcast. I'm Jamie and I'm the CEO of Crimson, and today I'm honoured to be here with Sir John Key, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, to take a deep dive into what his life was like back in high school, his tips for high schoolers in the future, and where he sees the future of careers and the job landscape going. Great to have you here, John.
Great to be here, Jamie.
Awesome. So why don't you take us right back to high school? Many of the listeners have heard about your accomplishments in office, accomplishments in Wall Street, but what was John Key like in high school? What was that like back then?
Okay, I better start by saying I'm 59, so we're going a long way back, Jamie. Okay, a couple of lifetimes for you. So, well, funnily enough, I went to Burnside High School in Christchurch, New Zealand. So Burnside at that point was the largest secondary school in the country. Had at that point 2,000 pupils. Today it has about 2,500. It's about eighth largest. So it was seen as this really quite innovative high school, actually, funny enough, because it had really had four schools within the school itself, if you like. So yeah, it was a co-educational facility, middle class New Zealand. I kind of grew up in this really poor household. My father died when I was really young, and it's a very long story. But so we really came from the poor suburb, and if you like, in the neighbourhood. But yeah, I mean, as a school to go to, it was a good place to go.
That's awesome. And when you were going through high school, what was your attitude? Did you view high school as something that you had to be at, or something that you were really kind of ambitiously pushing through with a clear goal? What was your head state like?
Yeah, I wanted to be there, so I enjoyed it. It wasn't something I went there and thought, I don't really want to be here. Secondly, the funny thing was that in New Zealand now, anyway, as you know, it's year 9 to year 13, typically. And I don't know the percentage of year 13s that would go to university and be tertiary qualified, but the answer would be a lot in the modern day. So I was in the top class at Burnside. When you think how big the school was, less than half of the top class went to university.
Wow.
And everyone, you could leave by what was effectively the fifth form, so that was 2 years earlier. Lots of people left that year. And then the sixth form, most people bailed out. And by the time you got to the seventh form, there weren't many people left. And even those classes, most of them didn't go to university. So I went to university because my mother, who was Austrian, and had been this Austrian Jewish refugee, after the Nazis invaded in 1939 to Austria. She absolutely understood the power of education to transform your life, and so she was singularly focused on me going to university and being tertiary qualified. Had a pretty strong view I should be an accountant as well, which actually I am, and kind of an economist, but I'm not a very good accountant, truth be known. So for me, it wasn't really a choice about whether I was going to university or not. I just, I went home once, I think, when I was about 15, and said, I might leave and become a horse trainer, and got this, monosyllabic answer like, no. Should we talk about it anymore? No. And that was it. So for me, I wanted to be there, but it was a means to, tertiary qualification.
Awesome. And in high school, did you see yourself as a leader back then, or was that something that came later on in your career? How did you see yourself as a young student?
I always enjoyed that sort of side of things, and I enjoyed speaking, I suppose. So I was in the debating club and all those different sorts of things. People who know me claim that I was incessantly going on that I was going to be Prime Minister. I don't know. Maybe that's true. Maybe they're recreating history. I was also interested in politics, actually. I was kind of like the idea of it. But I also had this sort of sense that I wanted to be a businessman and make money and have some financial independence before I went on. So to me, education was something that I saw as a means to achieving other things I wanted to do. Whereas I think legitimately some people say education's my life and I want to be an academic and I want to teach or do research or whatever. But for me, it was just a way of demonstrating I knew how to learn and had the credentials that meant I was worth hiring, I think, really.
I think a lot of our young people, when we ask them kind of why do you want to work hard at school, a lot of it is about it's a signal that I'm going to be great in the future. I can get the top jobs I want on Wall Street, things like this. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Back then, were you pretty sure that finance, accounting, business was a good route? Had you considered other career paths, going straight into politics, or was that?
Yeah, I definitely didn't want to go straight into politics. So I definitely wanted to have financial independence. And even then, I think I had a view, which I think is absolutely the right view personally, which is that, while it's good going into politics, some people go on young, and look, you've got lots of examples of that. Having done something else prior to having some different life skills, I kind of put a value on that and thought that was important. And I think, I just think in general, at the time when I did finance, I was always interested in business, and we had business clubs and things. Today it's a lot more sophisticated, a little bit more, snazzy really. But back then we had things, but it was quite a vanilla education system. So for all of the arguments about NCEA, which if you don't live in New Zealand, it's our qualification, largely qualification system. It offers you lots of different options and courses, but really when I went, it was English, maths, physics, biology, chemistry, accounting, economics. It was pretty vanilla.
And I think one interesting thing about how things have evolved is these days, if you see a company like Palo Alto Networks, which you're on the board of, many engineers getting hired in their 20s can leave college and be earning 100,000 plus in Silicon Valley with computer science education. But if you think about New Zealand, not many of our schools put much focus on computer science. How do you see that part kind of evolving? And, if you were to go back in high school, would that have been of interest to you as a pathway or not really?
Yeah, so we did a bit of, this is really giving you an idea of how far back you got to go, a bit of COBOL programming in high school. Well, actually, ANZ's, who I'm chairman of, has a few COBOL systems still running around, so we're actually desperately looking for people like went to school so they can fix up some of the things we need. I think if I had it all again, would I do something different? Maybe, I was just really lucky because I came out and eventually went investment banking after a bit of time in accounting and stuff. And that really suited me. It suited my personality, and it suited, I kind of lapped up the pressure that was involved in that and the international nature of it. And it was amazingly well paid and lucrative back in those days. So really it's very hard to argue I made the wrong career move. But one of the things I think that governments can legitimately ask is, do they want to put more emphasis on what actually the economy needs and wants? I mean, there's a sort of one school of thought that says it really doesn't matter. If you educate people, they'll drift into whatever field they like, and who cares whether they study ancient history of, whatever, Tibetan warriors. It'll somehow be useful because they've demonstrated that they have an ability to learn. And there's nothing wrong with that argument. But I do think, given the government pays a big share of the bill, there's an argument for saying, well, what do we want our economy to look like? And if you accept that view, then you start saying STEM subjects are really important. And actually we know that in the modern world, everything's digital, and everything's going to become more digital and more computer-driven, more, AI and all of those things. So if it was me and I just said, I want to make sure I've always got a job, there's certainly a strong argument that computer science is both fascinating but also still really lucrative way to go.
I recently was speaking to a lot of our Crimson alumni. I sent out a poll to our students that have gone off from these different countries to the US and the UK, and I asked them, what are the most common subjects you're doing at university now, and what are you using? And computer science, math and economics really rose to the top. It's interesting because when I was at college in the States, working for tech companies was pretty interesting to do, but investment banking, management consulting, these were really the most exciting paths. But I think there's been quite an explosion in interest in the computer science tech field pretty recently. And I was wondering, if you think to the finance world of today, how important are those math CS skills versus sales, macroeconomics in those areas like investment banking? Are those STEM skills something that are a must in finance or not as much?
Depends on what side of the business you're in, but as a general rule, what I'd say is when we were recruiting, say, at Merrill Lynch, we had the advantage of being a blue blood investment bank, and so we could choose from the very best Ivy League universities. And obviously we would look at people who are finance graduates, but we would look at people that were engineers, for instance, or people that had a physics degree, because we knew if they were mathematically literate that they could apply that and would be able to use that, and we could train them for what we wanted. So I think demonstrating a capacity to be able to be good in maths is really, really important. I mean, I think one of the reasons why it's moving a bit, you sort of said, well, you used to go to investment banks, or maybe you went to Bain or McKinsey's, or the obvious
still very popular.
Still very popular.
Super popular.
So, but the reason why investment banks are coming down is what's happened is that they used to be the sort of home of these incredible compensation packages, partly because they were paid massively in stock and options, and that was what dominated when I worked in investment banking in the first 20 odd years of my life. The reality is today that for a variety of reasons, regulators, what the community expects, a whole bunch of different reasons, in that area income's gone down. I mean, what you'd really argue today, if you really wanted to max out earnings, you probably wouldn't go investment banking, you'd go private equity. Or you would go, as you point out, in some tech startup or something. So there's lots of other ways. I mean, you have to attach yourself to the equity portion to really make big money. I mean, a certain number of people will get paid a lot in salary, but the blunt reality is you really make 10x, 20x, 30x when you've got the stock. So I think that the consultancy route is still really good because, a bit like audit, it exposes you to a variety of different cultures and organisations and a knowledge base. And you can sort of mock the 4-quadrant module and the way of thinking, but actually, ultimately, business is about problem solving and about getting ahead of the curve. It's not always about inventing the best, a new mousetrap. Really, sometimes I think people think I've got to invent, the thing that's going to knock Google over. Not necessarily. You might need to invent or have a product that is just better than the other products. And actually, if you look at the history of tech companies, there's a hell of a lot of tech companies that started first, had what looked like pretty good technology, and they didn't win the race.
Yeah, I think Skype and Zoom is a really interesting example. Skype was just so dominant when Crimson started in 2013. Totally. We used Skype for everything, and Zoom, just made some back-end improvements, made the calls better, and now it's, I think, 150 billion on the stock market today.
Google. I mean, when I first started out like everyone else, I mean, Yahoo was the search engine we used, and there were others before that. I mean, Google didn't invent. In New Zealand, TradeMe didn't invent an online marketplace. I mean, eBay and Amazon later times were there way before these guys, but they brought it to New Zealand. They focused on the market. They had good technology, and the rest is kind of history. So, I think sometimes people sit around thinking, I've got to find the one thing that's different. And sometimes in the technology space, you're seeing that because, you think about a world that's moving towards cloud. I see a lot of that at Palo Alto, where we're constantly buying businesses that are plugins for the total solution because, people are going to have increasingly amounts of their data on cloud or in the cloud, and therefore they're going to do lots of different things. They need these specific things, or it's just they work out way more efficient ways of operating. But as a general rule, it's like it would be easy to sit back, I think, sometimes and think every cool thing in the world's been invented. But I bet you we're about a millionth of the way through. That's the truth of it.
Yeah, I think an interesting example is Rocket Internet, which is a company in Germany that basically clones American businesses and runs them into other parts of the world. Yeah. And I think, given how dispersed the world is, it's really hard for an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley to raise all this money and then dominate every market simultaneously. And for a while, I think China, was working quite well, copying some of these US companies. Now it's almost the reverse, particularly in education. A lot of the most innovative companies are coming out of China and India, not necessarily the US.
Yeah, I mean, there was a sort of a theory that went around the world. Donald Trump says every day of the week that China steals intellectual property. Well, maybe some Chinese entities do, but, that's a bit like saying, Russian entities do and North Korean entities do, and you could name any country, New Zealand company might have involved itself doing that. But actually the real truth is, far from that, China's actually creating a huge amount of intellectual property. Go and have a look at what, say, someone like Sequoia, who are one of the most dominant, if not the most successful VC in Silicon Valley. They have a huge amount of resources in China, basically in China and Israel. And the reason is because there's so many amazing companies coming out of China. And I think if you go and have a look at the big tech companies out there, whether it's Alibaba or Tencent or whatever, I mean, their systems are amazing systems, and they've learnt digital payment systems and things long before a lot of other companies have. So yeah, I think at your peril you underestimate them actually. There's a lot of exciting things happening.
So this theme of competition and the idea the world today is a lot more globalized, and a company can, spread from China all around the world like TikTok can, for example, is really, I guess, relevant to our high schoolers, because they're going into an economy where they can't just be good within their home country or their home city, because, it's a global competitive landscape. So if you were in high school today in 2020, what kind of decisions would you make, and how would you think about your future, given how the world's evolved in the last little while?
Yeah, I think it's almost another way of sort of phrasing that question wouldn't be so much that they can't just be good in their home country, but why would they want to be? Because if you accept the world as globalized, and despite the odd barriers that we see a few politicians trying to put up at the moment, I mean the genie's out of the bottle, then the answer is you wouldn't want to be siloed to the country you come from, because if you like, for instance, New Zealand, that's a consumer base of 5 million people, when you know that China's probably producing that number of middle income consumers next year. so there is a very global world. I mean, I think, to me, what I would say is that firstly, if you think globally and you think big, then there's every chance you'll achieve that. I mean, people generally are limited by not the environment they live in, but their imagination actually half the time. It's that capacity to believe you can actually do something as much as is the ability to do it. And I think that's, having now, post-politics, spent quite a bit of time in Silicon Valley, what is amazing is, firstly you have this belief everyone succeeds. Well, that ain't true. There's a lot of companies that are doing a hell of a lot that fail. But what it is it's a place where it's is completely unbiased. It doesn't matter what ethnicity you are, what gender you are, what sexuality you are, all they care about is results. If you've got the product that works, they'll love you and buy you. And I kind of like that. I think that's really cool. I think, that's what the world's got to be about. Show me the solution and someone will pay for it. And so, if I was at high school now, I would be thinking, first thing I'd be thinking is make sure I have command of the English language. To be blunt, it's the language of business, whether you like it or not. I think secondly, and if you probably don't speak English, it'll probably be hard to listen to this podcast anyway, so the reality is you probably already do. Secondly, I definitely would be looking at the pockets of the world for what I'm doing that are really interesting. As I say, there's just some amazing stuff happening in Israel in the technology space, or obviously the US. Thirdly, I think we also live in a very different world now. Again, I'm not really from that generation. It was the generation before me, but that was the generation that worked for one company. You worked for the post office. You were there for 40 years. You retired. You got the gold watch. That was it. My generation was a bit more. Maybe you worked for 2 or 3 companies. That was kind of spreading out. Now it's like, wow, you could be bouncing around all over the show. People's CV. That used to be, that was a sign of instability. Now it's a sign of experience. So you work for lots of people.
If you keep an engineer for 2 years, you're doing well.
You're doing great. Yeah. Finding one's quite tough, actually. Software engineer.
And so I guess one of the best ways, at least I've seen young people being able to get this global exposure, is at university or at high school through exchanges. One thing you mentioned to me a while ago is that you were very interested in doing an Ivy League MBA, and I was wondering, what made you interested in that career pathway, that education pathway, and what did you kind of find when you went to Harvard, took some management classes about that experience? Was it what it was cracked up to be?
Yeah, so but if you go back and look at my degree, I've got a BCom in accounting, so that is such a vanilla degree that you'd sit there and go, in the modern world, most people do, a lot more than that. And I kind of get that. And that's because the currency now is one that's much deeper, I mean, back in those days, as I said, the differentiating factor was that you went to university. Now it's, how many degrees have I got? What layering does it look like? Where did I go? What are my grades? Like, it's a much more competitive world. By the time I went to Merrill, that was a different space, working in the United States, and a lot more people had MBAs or had different degrees, had taken time out of their, they worked and then gone, obviously, is typically the pattern with MBAs. And I kind of thought, well, A, I was academically interested, and B, I kind of thought it would be a really useful thing to have. They used to say to me, John, you'll be getting an MBA to get a job you already have, so why are you bothering? But I kind of thought, I still thought it was, quite a nice idea. And And we had this relationship with MIT and with Harvard, and we used to put quite a lot of money into their research programs and do different things. And so one of the things they did is, Harvard's all case study learning, and so they would put these companies together. In fact, the very first one I went to was on disruptive technology. And they had Kodak there, and never forget the CEO, chairman of Kodak was there, and if you think he was tough in his business, you should have seen our group, if you like, was sitting there going, mate, you're not even going to have a business in a couple of years, digital cameras, who the hell's, because they sold film, and film got developed. And actually those companies have never been that great at actually developing digital film. And it was interesting, they had a really eclectic, they had Gibson greeting cards were there, because again, in the modern world, how many people actually send a card? I mean, you probably do send a bereavement card, maybe for a wedding, the odd birthday, but it's not very common, is it?
Yeah.
The interesting thing with them, by the way, it was a really weird thing. They tested those guys in all these focus groups, and more people trusted Gibson greeting cards, because you get a bereavement card, this was a very sad time, or a wedding card, it's a happy time, but you trusted those messages, honestly, more than they trusted half these fund managers. And they had this theory that if they went up and set up a funds management business, it would be successful, because they had a trusted brand. It was kind of crazy. Anyway, I went there and that was amazing, and I learned a lot. But an online MBA would have given me the opportunity to keep the job I had and still advance the education. And I think that's one of the fantastic things about what we're doing at Crimson. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to step out of the environment you're in. You don't have to leave the country or the place you're in. I mean, you can choose to do all those things, but equally in a world where you might be juggling 2 or 3 balls, you can do all of those and advance your education. And I think it's a cliche, but it's true. Education's a lifelong learning process now. So if it's just going to be full-time in the classroom, I think that is going to exclude many people.
Yeah, I think COVID's been really interesting, because students that are quite ambitious now are no longer limited to just whatever opportunity is available within their country, but with this realm, a lot of extracurriculars have gone online. So for example, recently we had 2,000 young people compete in the Tiger Global Case competition, where they pitched solutions to how Sony should deal with Xbox and other competitors entering the market, from their, I guess, homes all around the world. And we had teams from Japan and Hong Kong and Auckland all participating. So I think in an online-centric world, you can sit in Auckland or you can sit in Moscow, and you can meet learners from all these different countries, do all these extracurriculars, and have a lot of the benefits that you might get if you were previously at a top New York private school, but from your home country. So I think it's a great access enabler if you're self-motivated. But on the other hand, I think if you don't have that intrinsic motivation, perhaps you can fall even further behind in that kind of online environment. So yeah.
I suspect actually online gamers probably worked that out a long time ago. They could be sitting in New Zealand and playing against somebody in Kazakhstan. I mean,
totally.
They sort of realised the world was a bit global. And I think the other thing about an online capability, I think that's really interesting, is that, like, if you go and look at books, this is true in New Zealand, it's probably true around the world. Number one selling books are cookbooks, right? So if you go and write a book,
and the Bible,
but not so much a big seller in New Zealand, really. But if you go and write a book, Jamie Beaton, my story about Crimson, it'll sell, and if it sells 10,000, 20,000, it'll be a massive seller. But if you do a cookbook, they sell a lot, right? But do you think people buy cookbooks to learn how to cook? Because the answer is they don't. They buy them for the pictures of the food, which they think looks cool. So if you go and say beef stroganoff, how do I make that, and type it into my Google search engine this afternoon, tell you what's going to come up. Not your cookbook. What's going to come up is your YouTube video, and I'm going to watch it and do it, right? And I just think that's sort of basically that we live in a world where people want things now, wherever they are, in the comfort of their own room, and half the time they want to watch a tutorial, like we do in our business, and I can look and see it, and I don't have to read everything that's there, and I can probably have my attention on something else at the same time, and I learn, so it's just a very different world.
You made a point earlier also about inspiration and how people are often limited by how much they're dreaming, I guess what their motivation levels are, that kind of thing. One thing I think is pretty interesting is lots of our students discover our day in the life videos about different universities. So, we have students, for example, take Jennifer Wright. She was an Auckland student, went to NYU, and she walks around the streets in New York and people come up to her and say, hey, I watched your video, I'm from Vietnam. I was inspired to kind of apply to the US because of this content. So I think the good thing about this environment now is you can find the inspiration a lot more easily. Previously, if your community is pretty inward looking and you don't have many mentors that have gone overseas and stuff like that, it's a huge jump. But I think these days, hopefully, the barriers have been reduced a lot by some of that content.
And partly it's just experience. I mean, it's all very well going and asking your parents or asking the career guidance counselor at school or whatever, but if you live in Wichita, Kansas, their experience might be whatever's happening in that state, and that's it. They're not necessarily thinking about, should I go out to Tsinghua University in Beijing and study. It's just different. And I think even now you're still breaking down a few barriers doing that. But and look, we live in a very globally competitive world where if you really want to be the top of your game, not just the top of your game in your town or your state or your wherever, then you are going to climb inevitably some bigger mountains, have bigger aspirations. But I always kind of think, life isn't about longevity. It's about what you achieve when you're on the planet. So, I would rather. I'd rather live a long and happy, healthy life. But if I'm truthfully honest, I'd rather live a life where I got some things done and achieved some things and gave things a go, even if they didn't always succeed straight away, than just, I lived this period of time and I never took any risks. And actually young people, by definition, why are young sports people often so amazingly successful? I mean, you see these young tennis players or young golfers or, we had, a young All Black running on the weekend for his first test, Caleb Clark. Why is he doing what he's doing? The answer is because they have no fear and they don't even think about it. They just give it everything. And it's that sort of freewheeling spirit that hopefully we harness by opening people's eyes to what's possible. Tell me what you can do, not what you can't do.
I think it's a really strong attitude. One thing that has been growing in popularity a lot is many of our alumni going into the Y Combinator Accelerator in Silicon Valley. So I think of students like Samil from New Zealand or Brendan in Australia who had never thought of entrepreneurship, but then came to this accelerator, was exposed to all these interesting tech entrepreneurs that in their 20s founded big companies, and then that becomes a reality they're shooting for. So they're not looking for necessarily a second year, job placement at Deloitte, but they're looking to, build a big tech company. So I think that really speaks to that, aspiration, and that students, can be told they should wait till they're 40 to create companies, but more and more so today, these young people are really charged up to just go for it.
Yeah, I think those days of waiting till you're 40, they're over, really. So I think if you look at a lot of those companies and those accelerators, they're actually really small companies often. I mean, they might not have more than 10 or a dozen people in them. They have an idea. They're utterly convinced they're going to dominate the universe in whatever they're doing. And actually, some of them do. And there's no shortage of money being thrown at these things. I mean, as we know, there's, in a world where interest rates, are lucky to get above 0.5%, there's a lot of capital in the world looking, for a home. So under the right conditions with the right idea, there's lots of opportunities. And the kind of cool thing about that is that, you get so much opportunity. And sometimes people say, oh, yeah, but, you're working 80, 90, 100 hours a week. Well, kind of who cares? I mean,
totally.
When you're young...
Yeah, you've got all the energy in the world. Go for it.
I used to go to work when I was at Banks Trust when I first started working. We'd go to work. We'd get up at 5:30 in the morning. We'd trade. We'd get woken up all night. I don't know how many hours we worked in the, Monday to Friday in the markets or Saturday morning. The answer was a lot. And if you'd asked me whether I had a job, I would have told you I don't have a job. I have something I love doing. It's not really a job. I mean, so I think it becomes a job when you are worrying about what time you punch in the morning, what time you leave in the evening. I mean, you're young. I mean, you want to do things. It's invigorating to do that.
I think that that passion is really electric for those early years, and then it's really interesting to see the people that can sustain it all their life. I think of Stephen Schwartzman from Blackstone.
Yeah.
He people that work at Blackstone, I was talking to a student of mine who asked me, what kind of hours is Blackstone? I said 9 to 3, and they said, that sounds really relaxed. And then I said, no, it's 9 a.m. to 3 a.m. Because in those early years, you're really grinding super hard. But I think it's really interesting how the work ethic in some of these places can be sustained for like 20, 30 years. I don't know if that's a good thing in those later years, but it's really interesting how there can be big cultural gaps between how hard people go, and it can be really, I think, a big symptom of their high school, their university, who they're exposed to, what they think is normal.
Yeah, and look, you want to have a life. It's not an argument to say that you only do that and you can't do something else. I mean, you probably want to do ultimately a bit of everything. But
sprints in and out.
As we said earlier, a lot of these jobs are not. You're not necessarily doing that. You might be Steve Jobs and be at Apple, for a very long period of time, while he was alive. But the reality is that people sort of interlope in and out of a lot of different things. So there's that opportunity. Anyway, those places are more about you wanting to be there doing those things. And
you build really good skills. Those Blackstone guys go on to build great companies, that kind of thing.
And they might go, ultimately might go into other things. And
a lot leave a couple of years in.
Yeah, people leave.
Good training.
They learn other skills and they go and do something else.
Same as the McKinseys and stuff. So we talked a little bit about this trend of youth entrepreneurship. And I guess one interesting trend that's pretty relevant now is youth in politics. So you see AOC in the US, Chloe Swarbrick here, Jacinda, this trend of a lot of people resonating with people that are relatively new to politics. Pete Buttigieg is another good example. What do you think's driving that? And do you think it's going to continue? Is it a short-term trend, or is it here to stay?
Yeah, I could be a cynic and say it's at both ends, because if you look at the US presidential nominees at the moment, both of them are in their 70s. So we've got both ends of the thing covered. But I think the trend towards younger people who don't necessarily have a lifetime of career experience in politics is not only going to stay, but I think it'll actually be a more dominant feature. When I went into politics, the average length of time someone spent in Parliament before they became Prime Minister was 18 years. And I was there 6 before I became Prime Minister. And that was the fastest. Longy had been there 7 years before me. Certainly in modern day history, I'm not sure if you go back a long way. Nowadays, I think, is it conceivable that someone could go on and in their first term become the leader of a major party and then become Prime Minister? The answer is absolutely. I think they could. And I think it's because as the years go by, people are realising that very young people can, dominate amazing companies. Look at Mark Zuckerberg. No one looks at him and says, "Gosh, he's young. He shouldn't be running Facebook." So I think our attitudes have changed, and partly I think actually the energy level in some of those jobs. So the only balancing act I'd say in politics is, do you have the capacity to understand? When you're young, sometimes your outlook on life is just a little bit different, and sometimes your experiences are a little bit different. So things like having a family or other sort of things that might occur a little bit later, they shape you and your thought process, and so that does change a little bit. But yeah, I think there'll be a range, but I definitely think that acceptance of young politicians will be there. To a degree, someone like JFK was pretty young, really.
What age did he get in?
He's mid-40s when he was president, wasn't he? 44,
pretty
45,
early for the US.
Yeah, I think so. For the US, absolutely.
Yeah.
As I say, we have the other extreme covered as well, but yeah.
We actually have an alumni, a boy called Sam Taylor, grew up in Mount Maunganui from the Maori community, got into Harvard, and he was in the Young Nats, and his goal is to basically come back and try to be the first Maori Prime Minister. So for Sam, who's now at Harvard, he's thinking about his career trajectory, what kind of skills he can build, and then how he can come back here and have an impact in his home country. So what kind of advice would you give him? Do you think that things like law or public policy, the kind of classic degrees that are often seen in politics, is the way to go, or should he be thinking about different types of skills? What would you recommend for Sam?
I honestly think kind of anything works, really. But one thing I'd say is lawyers tend to think a particular way.
Yeah, very risk averse usually.
Yeah, and they just have a different analysis that they, or sort of processing framework that they go through in their own head. And I used to sit in cabinet. We probably 6 of the 20 members of cabinet when I was Prime Minister were lawyers, and the lawyers sometimes would have an argument amongst themselves, and it wasn't really always about the actual substance. Yeah, it was more about how would the courts actually interpret this, and how would common law develop off the way we thought the courts would interpret what Parliament sort of said. So there's no doubt that if you understand the making of the law, or you understand the law, that when you become a lawmaker, that's a really useful set of skills to have.
Yep.
But equally, do you need to be a public policy expert, for instance, in mental health to be the health minister? Probably not. If you're a doctor, does it help? Yeah, it's probably interesting, but it wouldn't limit you on doing that. I think one thing I'd say is if you go all the way back to the heart of government, really, a lot of what government is about is collecting people's taxes to redistribute it in the form of what we think are public goods, really. And so ultimately, in any government, a lot of emphasis was put on the Prime Minister for very good reasons, or the President, but actually it's the Minister of Finance or the Secretary of the Treasury that really, in a lot of ways, they're in every discussion, involved in everything that goes on. So financial skills are always good skills to bring to Parliament, I think.
Yeah, probably good skills to have in general. Excellent.
Yeah, I think in anything you do, I mean, if you absolutely have to have it. If you don't have it, it's good to have someone you can rely on. But they're just important. That's important. In the end, they're the thing that can trip you up if you're running any business, isn't it? Really, you can have great ideas and things, but if you don't manage your cash flow properly, then it can end badly.
Last question for you. For young people today who are born in a particular country, there's a lot of migration happening. People, going to the US, going to the UK, going to Canada and stuff like this. Do you think we'll see a world where the notion of the country you're born in loses some of its significance, or do you think actually that's always going to be there, and a lot of these people will inevitably feel that cultural connection will come back to their home countries? What does the world of 2030, 2040 look like? Is it even more globalized, or is there going to be some of that nationalism kind of retained? I'm trying to think about where our Crimson kids might be in the future and wondering.
Well, at one level, you could make the case that, post the sort of industrial revolution, we've gone through this globalization revolution where, free trade's been in the order of the day, migration's been common, foreign capital's moved around the world. There's been all sorts of, and the internet was part of the opening up of that and exposure, I think, of other countries and what they meant. I think you can make the case actually that what Trump really was tapping into in the US was actually a feeling from a group of people in society that actually that was a failed experiment. That, they were left behind, that people didn't play by the same rules, and that somehow they just missed out, and that it wasn't the thing that they said. I'm an internationalist, I'm a globalist. I totally disagree with that strategy. I think that, those very people are the same people that walk into Walmart and buy a pair of Chinese, shoes, which are a fraction of the price they would be if they were buying them, made in locally, Kentucky, and they can afford them where they wouldn't be able to. So, trade isn't just about export jobs, it's also about, the import substitution that I have. So I don't think we're going to go back to a world where barriers are going to be so extreme, and I think they'll be at the margins, and that'll be true, I think, of international travel, and will these international universities pull the very best of the world into their alumni? Absolutely, they will. I don't think I might be wrong. I just don't know whether you would ever fully say that my country of origin no longer has any relevance to me, because I think it's. When you say to someone, what does it mean to come from New Zealand or whatever, they might say the All Black rugby team, or they might say big skies, or they might say farming, or they might say, our last bus stop before you meet Antarctica and the penguins. I don't know. I mean, people have a view of what their mental picture is, but most people, when they go and migrate somewhere else and live permanently somewhere else, they get to a point where they go over the threshold, and they say that country means to me now what my home country meant, and so I adopt all of that. And my mother did that. So when she came to New Zealand, she obviously could speak German because that was her. And I used to say to her, teach me German. And she'd say, that is a complete and utter waste of time, my boy. Accounting and economics. So my mates would come around after school and she would tutor them in German, but never thought I would ever need it because she lived in a world before the internet was there, before people really travelled the way they did. And she thought, that's a waste of time. Whereas now, you would say, well, that's the craziest thing in the world. I mean, if I can speak German, I'll talk to my kids at German, and they'll speak English at school, and I'll be multilingual. And as we know, if you can learn one additional language, you can probably learn 10. So I think there'll always be that. I come from India, and there's just something about that country that means something to me that's deeper than just, that I obviously look like I'm Indian. I think there's more to it than that. But there's no doubt the world is. The world is global, and so many people, I think, will eventually say my home is going to be somewhere other than where I was born or where the nucleus of my family is. The one thing I would say, actually, and it's not always at the highest levels of education, I reckon you've got to have enormous respect for people that move overseas and live somewhere else. And the reason for that is that you take away all of the safety
support systems,
all of the support systems,
family connections,
and in the end, somehow you're on your own when you're doing that. And I often get into Ubers and things in New Zealand, and someone might have been here when I was Prime Minister, so they know me or whatever, but they might have been back in New Zealand for 8 days, and they're driving an Uber and they're packing shelves somewhere else, and they're doing something.
3 different jobs.
You just know in 10 years' time
they're going to make
own
it.
a house and make it, exactly. And it's all attitudinal. And that's the thing I would say to people listening to this podcast is that, yep, you can limit yourself by what you think failure might look like, or what you might trip up on, or why someone who's you respect has told you can't get to that university or that place. Or you can say, well, I'll just roll the dice, I'll give it everything I've got, and there's nothing wrong with failure, there's something terribly wrong with not trying.
It's a beautiful message to end on. Thanks, John.
Thank
awesome
you.